Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep. Welcome to the last discussion on disaster management. In the previous class, we had almost completed the syllabus. We were left with just one topic, the last topic, which is the disaster management framework in India. If you remember, we had studied the global framework created under the United Nations to deal with disaster management. We discussed how disaster management became more proactive and how governments became more proactive in dealing with disasters after 1990s. Because prior to that, governments were largely reactive. They were adopting a ad hoc approach towards disaster management. Before the 1990s, there was no structured response towards disaster management. But thanks to the UN conference, the Yokohama conference and the Hyogo conference, by 2000, by early 2000, around the world, there was a comprehensive approach, a holistic approach towards dealing with disasters. So, in India as well, we witnessed those changes thanks to the enactment of the DM Act or the Disaster Management Act that was passed with the Parliament in 2005. For India, the motivation was that prior to the enactment of the Act, there were three major disasters that caused a lot of devastation in the country. Throughout our sessions, I've been mentioning those disasters. I'm sure many of you would remember that as well. The 99 super cyclone in Odisha, which killed almost 10,000 people. The super cyclone in Odisha, which caused extensive damage along the east coast, killing almost 10,000 people. Then we had a devastating earthquake, the Bhuj earthquake in Gujarat, which flattened the city of Bhuj, killing thousands of people again. Then after this, in 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami caused extensive damage to Andaman Nicobar Islands and Tamil Nadu. Almost 1 lakh people were killed in India by the Indian Ocean tsunami. So these three major disasters that occurred in late 90s and early 2000, these were a wake-up call for India. It was a learning lesson for India that we can't be reactive anymore. We have to focus on a scientific approach, a holistic approach. We have to prioritize early warning and forecasting. So following this, the then Manmohan Singh government, the UPA government, took a landmark step by enacting the Disaster Management Act through the Parliament. It is this law which creates the legal framework for disaster management in the country. Through the DM Act, several new institutions were set up in India to deal with disasters. It introduced the concept of disaster management cycle and prioritized all three phases of disaster management. The pre-disaster phase, where we focus on planning and preparation in order to prevent a disaster or mitigate the impact of a disaster. Then during disaster phase, to improve our response, to provide better emergency relief. And it also focused on post-disaster management to prioritize recovery, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. So this institutionalized a structured response towards disaster management, and here onwards, disaster management became a part of mainstream governance. Disaster management was mainstreamed into governance. Is that clear? So this law not only defined India's approach towards disaster management, but also established many new institutions, which we are going to study. And it helped in mainstreaming governance, mainstreaming disaster management into governance, thus placing the responsibility on the central government, the state governments, and the local governments, especially at the district level. So this was the major turnaround in India's approach towards disaster management. The district level authorities were given a primary responsibility to deal with disasters. At the state level and central level, there would be adequate resource allocation, policy planning, decision making, which would enable the local bodies to execute the disaster management policy and plan. Understood? So, in this session, we are going to study this framework. We will look at the new institutions that have been created. We'll understand what is their role, what's their responsibilities. We'll talk about the composition of these new institutions. And we shall discuss the National Disaster Management Policy that was notified by the National Disaster Management Authority in 2009, based on which the National Disaster Management Plan has been notified in 2016. Is that clear? So under the law, India has brought out a policy, a national policy, and a national plan. A policy basically provides the broad framework. It provides the approach. It lays down the guidelines. So policy is very broad. It does not provide the specifics. It lays down the guidelines and gives a broad approach to disaster management. Whereas under the plan, the specific measures have been described for every single disaster, be it natural or man-made. The national policy has laid out a broad approach and a plan. And under the plan, you have the specific measures which have been listed out, which has to be followed by all the concerned institutions. So the National Disaster Management Authority has notified both the policy and the plan in 2009 and 2016, respectively. So let's take a look at the DM Act. Let's understand some of the key provisions, and let's also discuss the institutions that have been created. Under the DM Act, a three-tiered disaster management mechanism has been established in the country. This is the first point you have to remember. A three-tiered disaster management mechanism at the national level, state and district level, going all the way till your local bodies, that is your Panchayati Raj institutions, your municipal bodies and corporations. Even these local bodies play a critical role in implementing the disaster management framework. Is that clear? Along with the district administration, the local bodies at the taluk level, at the village level, at the Gram Panchayat and Gram Sabha level, right? The Panchayati Raj institutions, municipal bodies, city corporations, they play a very, very important role in implementing the national policy and national plan. It essentially lays out the institutional framework. It creates many new institutions, as I told you. It creates a legal framework. It assigns certain responsibilities to the central government. It assigns certain responsibilities to the state government as well. It establishes few funds to provide the budgetary support for disaster management. The financial framework also has been provided through the Act. And it also defines how coordination will be achieved between the different stakeholders. It defines the center-state relations with regard to disaster management. Is that clear? It defines the coordination mechanism for various government entities. So this is how the DM Act introduced a transformation, a paradigm shift happened in India's disaster management. It created a three-tiered architecture, assigning responsibilities to different entities of the government, laid out a legal framework, established a financial framework, and provided for coordination as well. So these are not essentially parallel structures. They don't operate independently. They all coordinate, they all work together under a single framework. The center will not do what it wants. The states will not do what they want. They will all coordinate their actions. They will all synchronize their policies and plans and implement the measures jointly. So, for that, achieving harmony, achieving coordination is very, very important across all the three tiers of the government. But the most important change that happened was the shift from a relief centric approach towards a proactive approach in disaster management. This is the shift I'm talking about from the first class. Right? I told you that before 1990s, around the world, governments were reactive. They were focusing only on relief. They were focusing on providing some assistance during disaster. Even in India, it was the same approach. Prior to 2000, in India, the approach was a very reactive approach where basic relief would be extended during a disaster. That is, after a disaster has happened, then some emergency assistance would be given. Basic rescue operations would be conducted. We didn't even have designated response forces. We would rely on the armed forces. We would rely on the central armed police forces. Right? They never specialized in disaster management. So we didn't have any specialist force before this law. So whatever forces were available, the security forces, they were being used in disaster management. So they would carry out some basic search and rescue operations. Governments would provide some basic relief, medical aid, supply food, shelter, etc. And after a few days, everybody would forget about the disaster. There was no preparation, no planning involved. There was no focus on reconstruction, recovery. There was no priority given to bring normalcy back to the affected region. So this was the reactive approach in India. It was a relief-centric approach, just giving relief to the affected people. But due to the DM Act, India has adopted a proactive approach where we prioritize planning, preparedness to focus on prevention and mitigation. We have prioritized early warning and forecasting. We have improved our relief efforts. We have raised specialist forces with special training and special equipment who can respond in a professional manner to deal with disasters. And we have also given top priority to recovery, where we focus on reconstruction, rehabilitation. We try to rebuild the affected area to restore normalcy to that region. So all the phases of disaster management have been incorporated in India through the DM Act. That's why I told you, it has provided for the implementation of the DM cycle. That is the 3 phases of disaster management. This has been mainstreamed into day-to-day governance. So as future bureaucrats, as future police officers, as future civil servants of the country, all of you would be involved in the field of disaster management as well. The district collector, the superintendent of police, right? And many other top officials will play a direct role almost on a day-to-day basis in the field of disaster management. So every entity has a responsibility here to include disaster management as a part of their responsibility. It has created this 3-tiered architecture, which we are going to study in detail. Let's take a look at the new institutions that have been set up, right? Let's understand what is their role, what is their composition, and what functions have been assigned to them. This basic understanding is very important for your prelims and even for your mains. In prelims, there can be factual questions based on the role, composition, and functions of these institutions. You can expect straightforward factual questions in your prelims. In mains as well, there can be a detailed question asking you to talk about the institutions that have been set up through the Disaster Management Act. Or UPSC might ask you to illustrate the role of National Disaster Management Authority or the composition of National Disaster Response Force. So such specific questions can come in your mains as well. So through the Act, a total of 9 institutions have been created. We have the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority, which was set up, and it is the apex level body with regard to disaster management. Apex body means the topmost body, the highest decision-making body. So with regard to disaster management in India, the highest decision-making body would be the NDMA. To implement the policy and the plan, NDMA is the prime agency, the prime government institution. So it has been established as the apex body at the national level, along with similar authorities at the state level. At the state level, SDMAs have been established, state disaster management authorities. So in every state, you have a SDMA which is functioning today. Is that clear? Then finally, at the district level, we have DDMAs, District Disaster Management Authority. In every single district of the country, there is a DDMA which is functioning under the command of the DC or the DM of the district. Right? It's usually a IAS officer who becomes a DC or a DM. Right? So these officials play a critical role in heading the DDMAs and in implementing the disaster management policy and plan. They have the primary responsibility to respond to a disaster, to implement all the measures that have been outlined. So along with these disaster management authorities at national, state, and district level, we also have National Executive Committee and a State Executive Committee. As the name itself indicates, they play a role in execution. Is that clear? They execute the policy and plan. Whereas NDMA, SDMA are largely decision-making bodies. They come out with the broad policy, they notify the policy and the plan, right? They make the big decisions. But final execution rests with the National Executive Committee and the State Executive Committee. These are execution-oriented agencies or institutions of the government. Next, a specialist force has been established known as the NDRF, the National Disaster Response Force, a highly specialist force with all the required resources, training, and equipment has been set up to provide emergency relief and to conduct search and rescue operations. Similarly, at the state level, we have SDRF, State Disaster Response Forces. All the concerned states, they will have their own SDRF or State Disaster Response Forces. So these response forces will coordinate with each other. They'll work together, right? And they'll help in search and rescue operations. That is their primary task, primary responsibility. Then with regard to finance, 2 dedicated funds were proposed by the law: a National Disaster Response Fund and a National Disaster Mitigation Fund. So the law proposes 2 funds, one for response, one for mitigation. But out of the 2 funds, only one has been established. Please make a note of this. It's a very important point. We will discuss all these points in detail. I'll come to it. We'll take up each institution separately. All right. But first, understand which are the new institutions created through the Disaster Management Act. So for financing, it proposed 2 funds, a response fund and a mitigation fund. Out of the 2, only one fund has been established by the government. That is the response fund. The National Disaster Response Fund has been set up. and you also have State Disaster Response Fund. Is that clear? These funds will be used only for response, that is for emergency relief. That is during disaster, when a disaster is about to happen or when a disaster has already happened, to conduct search and rescue operations, to provide some immediate compensation to the affected people, right? For that, a lot of money would be required. So governments can't wait for funds to be drawn from the Consolidated Fund of India, right? So what they have done, a separate fund, a dedicated fund has been created, a National Disaster Response Fund at the center and State Disaster Response Funds at the state level. These are readily available funds to finance the emergency relief operations, to conduct search and rescue, to give immediate compensation, to procure medicines, to procure food, shelter, and clothing, and distribute all these necessities to the affected victims. So during disaster, relief operations are funded through the response fund. Is that clear? Please make a note of this point. So the response fund has been established, but the mitigation fund has not been established. Later, I'll explain why. We'll discuss more about these institutions. So there we'll understand why the mitigation fund has not been set up. Till date, we do not have the National Disaster Mitigation Fund. It's only provided by the law, but it does not exist. It has not been set up. But the NDRF, the National Disaster Response Fund, and State Disaster Response Funds have been set up and they're functioning. And they are the ones which finance the relief operations. Then finally, a training cum research institution has been set up, known as NIDM, National Institute of Disaster Management. The National Institute of Disaster Management has been set up like a think tank, like a university, like an academic institution. It will conduct research and development in the field of disaster management. It will fine-tune the response measures. It will better understand hazards. It will focus on creating the hazard vulnerability map. It will focus on the right technologies needed to improve disaster management. So all such research activities are undertaken by NIDM along with training. NIDM provides training courses to all government officials and government organizations. NDRF, district level authorities, state level authorities, they are all trained by NIDM. Even foreign governments are sending their disaster management officials to India to get them trained at NIDM. So it's like an academic institution, it's a university, a research institution, right, which is entirely focused on disaster management. So these are the 9 institutions that are part of the disaster management framework in the country. Now let's take up these institutions one by one. We will understand the composition of these bodies, right? Who are part of it? What is the role? What exact functions have been assigned to these institutions? So based on that, it's very easy to go through this chapter and complete this topic in a very short time. Let's begin with the apex body. Let's begin with the highest decision-making body in the field of disaster management, the NDMA. The NDMA is headed by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister of the country becomes the ex officio chairperson of NDMA. I hope everyone understands the term ex officio. Ex officio means by virtue of holding one position, automatically you get to hold one more position. That is what you mean by ex officio. Like for example, the Vice President of India becomes the chairman of Rajya Sabha. Correct? You would have studied this in Indian polity. So by virtue of being the Vice President of the country, he or she automatically becomes the chairperson of Rajya Sabha. No one else can become the chairperson of Rajya Sabha. There's no appointment involved, no elections, right? by virtue of being the vice president of the country, automatically the vice president becomes the chairman of Rajya Sabha. So that is what you mean by ex officio. So similarly, by virtue of being the PM of the country, whoever becomes the PM of the country, automatically he or she becomes the chairperson of NDMA. Understood? NDMA consists of a maximum of 9 members nominated by the Prime Minister. So essentially, the government of India, through the PM, appoints 9 members. Experts are brought into the organization. Former officials, retired officials, officials from the armed forces, right? Scientific experts, experts from private industry. They are brought into the institution to provide that expertise and guide the functioning of NDMA. Is that clear? So a maximum of 9 members can be nominated by the PM, and to handle the day-to-day functioning of NDMA, there is also a vice chairman appointed by the PM. The PM appoints a vice chairman who heads the organization on a day-to-day basis. Because obviously you can't expect the PM to drive the functions of the NDMA, right? The PM will attend the meetings once in a while, give some policy direction, but on a day-to-day basis, the organization is headed and run by the vice chairman who is appointed by the Prime Minister. So this is the composition of NDMA. In total, it will have a maximum of 11 members, right? 1 chairman, 1 vice chairman, and a maximum of 9 members. So total around 11. So let's understand what exactly is the function of NDMA. What does it do? What powers have been assigned to it under the DM Act? Let's focus on that. There are few important points that you need to note down, because you can get a 10-mark question in your mains. UPSC might ask you to talk about the composition, powers and functions of NDMA. All right, it's very factual, very straightforward. Nothing much to analyze as such. You just should know the facts, and if you're able to bring it out, you'll be able to write a good answer for such a question. So now that we know the composition, let's focus on the powers, the functions of NDMA. One of the key responsibilities of NDMA is to ensure that a national policy, plan and guideline is brought out to deal with disasters. NDMA has a primary responsibility to ensure that a national policy is in place, which defines the broad approach. A national plan is in place, which provides the specific measures for every single disaster. And there should be guidelines for the government, guidelines for the public, and for the industry. Ensuring that these policies, plans, and guidelines are in place is the primary role of NDMA. Is that clear? Please make a note. This is point number 1. Next, the second point. NDMA is responsible for drafting, approving, and notifying the national policy on disaster management. This was done 4 years after the law was enacted in the year 2009. The NDMA drafted a national policy based on inputs from all the stakeholders. It went through several revisions. The final policy was approved and notified in the official gazette by the NDMA. So India's national policy on disaster management was notified in 2009. This provides the broad approach of all government entities towards disaster management. Is that clear? The policy measures are laid out under this document, which was notified by NDMA in 2009. Once this is done, once this exercise is completed, based on the national policy, a national plan has to be prepared. a national plan has to be prepared by the National Executive Committee. The executing committee, the NEC, the National Executive Committee, will have a responsibility to prepare the national plan, which outlines the specific measures for every disaster based on the national policy which has been approved and notified. So it's basically a two-step process. First, the law was enacted. These institutions came into existence. And the law says that NDMA's role is to first bring out the policy, lay the broad approach, approve and notify the policy. Based on that, a national plan has to be prepared by National Executive Committee. This national plan has to be approved and notified by the NDMA. Is that clear? It is prepared by National Executive Committee and submitted to NDMA. NDMA approves the plan and notifies the plan. So India has completed this in 2016, and we have incorporated all the measures of Sendai framework. We have incorporated the 4 goals, the 4 broad priorities, and the 7 targets that have been laid out under the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction has been implemented in India. We have incorporated those priorities and targets through the National Disaster Management Plan that was prepared by National Executive Committee. It was approved and notified in the year 2016, thus completing the process of policy making and planning. Is that clear? I'll repeat this point. As part of the DM Act, it is essential to create a national policy and a national plan. The policy provides the broad approach, whereas the plan provides the specific measures. Based on that, further guidelines are brought out. So NDMA's job is to ensure that the policy, plan, and guidelines are in place as soon as possible. So accordingly, NDMA's responsibility was to draft, approve, and notify the national policy, the broad approach, which was done in 2009. The national policy incorporated principles of Yokohama strategy and Hyogo framework. The principles of Yokohama strategy and Hyogo framework were adopted into the national policy on disaster management that was brought out in 2009. Based on this broad approach, based on this national policy, the national plan has been prepared by National Executive Committee, which includes the Sendai framework priorities and targets as well. So this national plan was approved and notified by NDMA in 2016. So this process is complete. Right now, the specific measures, the broad policy, the guidelines for every disaster is clearly spelled out by the government. So it was NDMA's responsibility to ensure that, and it has already completed these tasks. Is that clear? It has even brought out the specific guidelines. Now, if you visit the website of NDMA, I hope you guys have already done that because I suggested this last week itself, right? So if you visit the NDMA's website, you can take a look at the national policy document, the national plan document, and also the guidelines for every disaster. Is that clear? Let me know in the comments if you guys have seen the NDMA website, if you have taken a look at the policy, plan, and the guidelines. Let me know in the comments, yes or no. Did anyone put that effort to visit NDMA's website and take a look at the policy, plan, and guidelines? Anyone? No. Most of them are saying no. Why? You should have done this. See, these are some basic measures you have to take as part of your preparation, right? In the very first class, I told you NDMA's website is a very good source for your information, for your content. If not, if you haven't done it, It's okay, but still you have time. Please visit NDMA's website, spend some time on it. Go through the website, navigate, find out the policy, plan, and guidelines. You don't have to read everything. These are very big documents. In fact, whatever we have studied in these classes, it's largely based on the national policy and plan. All right? You don't waste your time in reading the entire policy and plan. These documents run into hundreds of pages, almost 1,000 pages. So that is not needed. You don't have to go through every single page. But just take a look. Just get familiar with how government policies are brought out, how the plans are drafted, right? What kind of details go into it. Just take a look for your better understanding. In the class, I've covered everything. All the important points from the policy and plan I've taken from here itself. This is the prime source for our material. All right? But I want you guys to visit the website and take a look as well. So apart from this, NDMA exercises control, superintendent's command and control over the NDRF, the National Disaster Response Force. The next important point. So NDRF reports to NDMA. It comes under the command of NDMA. So the recruitment of NDMA, its establishment, the recruitment of NDRF, right? The raising of this specialist force, their training, their resources, their equipment, their deployment, everything is decided by NDMA. So NDMA is the controlling authority of NDRF. The entire superintendence and control of this response force, the specialist response force, is vested with the National Disaster Management Authority. Is that clear? Then finally, the last point, NIDM also works under NDMA. The National Institute of Disaster Management, which is the academic institution, the research institution, right? Even NIDM functions under NDMA. So managing the NDRF and NIDM is also the responsibility of NDMA. So these are the key points that you have to note down. All right? This helps you understand the composition, the powers and functions of NDMA. You can expect a 10 marks mains question or even a direct prelims question based on this. I hope it is clear to everyone. Now let's move on to the next institution, the National Executive Committee or NEC. If you understand NDMA and NEC, it's very easy to understand the state level institutions because it's exactly the same structure, the same role, but only the composition will slightly change. Instead of Prime Minister, it will be Chief Minister, right? So only the composition changes, but the role function remains the same at the state level. So understand NDMA and NEC properly. The state level bodies will become very simple. So NEC is the executive committee of the NDMA. It's like the executive organ of NDMA. So if NDMA is here, if it is at the top of the pyramid, NEC comes right below NDMA. All right? This is the relationship between NDMA and NEC. The National Executive Committee is like the executive organ. What does it execute? It executes the national policy, plan, and guidelines. The decisions of NDMA, they are to be implemented by the National Executive Committee. So the approach laid out under the policy, the specific measures laid out under the plan, and the guidelines for all disasters, they are implemented, enforced by the National Executive Committee. This is the primary responsibility of NEC. So this key body is headed. It is headed by the Union Home Secretary. The chairperson of National Executive Committee is the Union Home Secretary. Usually it's a senior IAS officer, a secretary level IAS officer, who's appointed as the secretary to the Ministry of Home Affairs. Is that clear? That's because MHA is the nodal ministry for disaster management. Understood? MHA is responsible for related aspects like center-state relations, internal security, right? To maintaining stability within the country. So MHA also has been given responsibility to deal with such emergencies that includes all types of disasters. So MHA becomes the nodal ministry for disaster management, whereas NDMA is the nodal agency, nodal authority to deal with disaster management. So the Union Home Secretary acts as the chairperson of NEC, and it also includes all the top secretaries to the government of India. Because when dealing with a disaster, right, you need involvement from various ministries, from various government institutions and organs, right? We studied that in previous classes. The armed forces might have to be called in. Indian Army, Navy, Air Force may have to assist NDRF. So Ministry of Defense would be involved, right? The service chiefs of armed forces will have to be involved. Then you have your Ministry of Agriculture, Rural Development, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Ministry of Environment. All these are key ministries which also deal with disasters, their respective fields of expertise. So all the top secretaries from these ministries and departments are part of this committee. Is that clear? For example, the Foreign Secretary from the Ministry of External Affairs is part of the committee. Because in dealing with disasters, we may have to cooperate internationally with other countries, with global institutions, or we may be extending support to another country. So it involves an element of foreign relations of India. So the Foreign Secretary of India is part of National Executive Committee. Then the heads of the Department of Atomic Energy, the Department of Space, representing ISRO, DRDO. Such scientific institutions will also be represented. The respective heads of these government institutions will also be part of the executive committee, right? The secretaries of Ministry of Earth Sciences, which plays a key role in early warning and forecasting. Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Power, Ministry of Road Transport. All these key ministries are represented to achieve coordination at the official level, to achieve coordination between top government officials, and also to achieve center-state coordination. These secretaries are included in the National Executive Committee under the chairmanship of the Union Home Secretary. This is the composition of the Executive Committee. Is that clear? Its primary role is to act as the executive organ of NDMA and implement the policy, plan, and guidelines. The other responsibility of the Executive Committee was to prepare the national plan based on the national policy. That is a point we already discussed, right? While discussing NDMA, I already mentioned this. So NDMA's responsibility was to bring out the national policy, which was done in 2009. So based on the policy, the Executive Committee prepared the national plan, which was finally approved and notified by NDMA in 2016. So this was the other responsibility of National Executive Committee. Is that clear? So its responsibility is to achieve interministerial coordination. It has to achieve interministerial and interdepartmental coordination at the central government. It will have to coordinate with all the concerned ministries and government departments and agencies. It will also have to achieve center-state coordination. This is a primary responsibility of the Executive Committee, right? So in order to implement the policy plan and guidelines, the NEC has to achieve coordination with various ministries, government departments, and the state level authorities. So this is the role and composition of the National Executive Committee. To prepare the national plan, assist NDMA in its functions, implement the plan and policy which has been finally approved by NDMA, ensure compliance with the directives of the central government, and act as a coordinating body and monitor the efforts across the country. Understood? So it's the executive organ implementing all these policies and decisions. So please make a note of all the key points. Even this is very, very important. It prepares the national plan to be approved by NDMA, prepares the guidelines for various ministries and organs of the government, which is finally approved by NDMA, provides any assistance and support needed for state governments and district authorities, monitors the implementation of the plan and guidelines at the national level, and achieves coordination and advises and assists all the concerned ministries and departments. So it's like a central hub at the national level, coordinating with all central agencies and state level authorities. Clear? So this is about National Executive Committee. Now, based on this, you can easily understand what is SDMA and State Executive Committee. It is exactly the same, only the composition changes slightly. So SDMA is headed by the Chief Minister. Just like NDMA is headed by Prime Minister, SDMA chairperson is the Chief Minister of the state. So the responsibility of SDMA is to bring out state policy, bring out a state level plan and approve that. That is the responsibility. And in accordance with the plan, lay down the guidelines. But of course, the state policy plan and guidelines has to be in line with national policy plan and guidelines. The national policy plan and guidelines will have to be followed under the state policy plan and guidelines. States can't come up with drastically different policy plan and guidelines. It has to be in line. It has to synchronize with the national policy plan and guidelines. Is that clear? Now, this is very, very important. I'll explain why. The DM Act understands the importance of decentralization. It understands the importance of delegation. This is the key point you have to note down. The DM Act is not just creating a centralized architecture. See, sometimes while dealing with emergencies, centralized architecture is good because it avoids confusion. It provides for streamlined decision making. But along with a centralized architecture, you need a decentralized architecture as well, right? Because in every state, the geography is different. The disasters being dealt with is different. The challenges are different. Now, some states are rich, some states are very poor, right? Some states are very vulnerable to multiple disasters. Some states are relatively safe. Some states are affected only by earthquakes. Some states are affected by cyclones, tsunamis, and flooding. So you can't just have a national policy and plan. You have to customize it depending on the condition of each state, depending on its geography, depending on its hazard and vulnerability. The policy and plan has to be customized. So to bring that customization, you need to provide for decentralization and delegation. This is the beauty of DM Act. Along with a strong centralized architecture, it provides that flexibility. It provides states the flexibility needed so they can incorporate the customization. They can bring in any additional policy changes, plans, and guidelines. But overall, it has to be in line with the national framework. Is that clear? So SDMA brings out the state policy and approves it. And it approves the state plan, which is prepared by State Executive Committee. And finally, the guidelines are also notified. It coordinates the implementation of the plan by working with State Executive Committee and the NDMA and National Executive Committee. The SDMA will have to coordinate with NDMA and NEC at the center and State Executive Committee and other bodies at the state level. So this coordination is achieved. It establishes a state disaster response fund. Is that clear? The mitigation fund has not been set up, as I told you. Both center and state governments have not set up any mitigation fund, but response fund has been set up. It reviews the overall plans and preparedness and guides the district level authorities to implement the disaster management measures. This is the role of SDMA, headed by the Chief Minister of the state. The State Executive Committee acts as the executive organ of the SDMA. It's very similar to National Executive Committee. So here the State Executive Committee is headed by the Chief Secretary of the state. At the center, the Union Home Secretary heads the National Executive Committee. But here at the state level, the Executive Committee is headed by the Chief Secretary, who's the topmost bureaucrat, the topmost civil servant in the state, at the state level. Right? Usually it's an IAS officer again, right? The Chief Secretary of the state, who's the highest ranking bureaucrat within the state. So they are the chairperson. He or she would be the chairperson of State Executive Committee, along with the secretaries of all the key government departments. The secretaries of all the important state government departments, they will be members of the Executive Committee. So secretaries from Finance Department, Home Department, right? Panchayati Raj Department, Rural Development, Agriculture, Irrigation, Power, from all these important departments at the state level, secretaries will be a part of it. They will come under the Chief Secretary, right, to form the State Executive Committee. So one of the key roles of State Executive Committee is to prepare the state plan. The state plan is prepared by the State Executive Committee. And then it is submitted to SDMA for approval. It's exactly the same with NDMA and National Executive Committee. NEC prepares the plan, submits that to NDMA, NDMA approves and notifies the plan. Similarly, State Executive Committee prepares the state plan, submits that to SDMA, and SDMA will approve and notify the state plan. So it will coordinate with all the stakeholders. It will coordinate with SDMA, National Executive Committee, with the response forces and district level authorities to implement all the measures under disaster management. So these are the national and state level institutions. Now we come to the district authority, the DDMA, the District Disaster Management Authority, which is headed by the district collector, by the DC or DM. See, in different states, this role is known by different names. For example, in Uttar Pradesh, right, this office or this role is referred to as District Magistrate or DM. In Andhra Pradesh, it's known as the District Collector, right, the District Collectorate. That's the office headed by District Collector or the DC. In Karnataka, this office or this position is known as the Deputy Commissioner of a district. The names are different from state to state, but the role is exactly the same, right? It's an IAS officer, usually a junior IAS officer who becomes the DC or DM. So he or she who heads the district administration will ex officio become the chairperson of DDMA. That's why I told you, as future bureaucrats, as future IAS officers, you are going to play a critical role in implementing the disaster management policy and plan at the district level. See, at the central and state level, planning will be done, resource allocation will be done, but actual implementation, execution happens at the grassroots. It happens at the district level and local body level. So that is why civil servants play a critical role. Is that clear? That's the reason why the subject has been added into our syllabus. Why else UPSC would expect aspiring civil servants to study this subject? This could have been taught later, right, in your probation. But UPSC expects you to have this basic knowledge even before you enter the service. You should have an understanding of disasters. To what extent is India affected? What measures are being taken? What policies we have in place? Right? That is why this subject has been added in the syllabus. So the DC or DM plays a critical role as the chairperson of DDMA and works with the elected representatives of the local body. The Zilla Panchayat will have a elected chairperson who's elected by the people of the district. So he or she becomes a co-chairperson of the DDMA. So basically DDMA has representation both from government officials, the bureaucracy, and also from elected representatives. Is that clear? The Zilla Panchayat chairperson will be the co-chairperson and the DC or DM will be the chairperson. The committee or the authority also includes the SP, the superintendent of police, who's a IPS officer, a junior IPS officer who heads the district police, right? All such key officials, even the forest officer from Indian Forest Service, they're all part of the district disaster management authority, right? So they are the ones who guide and implement the actual measures on the ground with regard to planning, preparedness during disaster and post-disaster. So all the planning, coordination, implementation at the district level is achieved by the DDMA right down to the taluk level and the Gram Panchayat, Gram Sabha level. So all the local bodies play a role. Your Panchayati Raj institutions and municipal bodies, right till the grassroots, they all play a role under the DDMA in the field of disaster management. Is that clear? So DDMA will prepare district-wise plans, just like a national plan and state plan is prepared. Based on that, based on the national and state plan, a district level plan is prepared by consulting with the elected representatives of the panchayats, right? The DC or DM is responsible to bring out a district level disaster management plan, which is in line with the national plan and state plan. So the specific guidelines, measures which are prescribed by the central government, by the state government, right? They're all implemented here at the grassroots. All the planning and preparedness measures as part of pre-disaster preparation. All the measures for effective response and relief. The measures for post-disaster management, for recovery, reconstruction, for providing compensation. All these measures are implemented here at the district level through the DDMA. So that's why the DDMAs play a very, very important role. They are the grassroots institutions. They work with all the three tiers of Panchayati Raj institutions and municipal bodies, right? They work with Taluk and Gram Panchayats and Gram Sabhas. They work with the local elected representatives and provide for full implementation of disaster management measures. So this is the three-tiered architecture from the nationals to state to district level, which has been created by the Disaster Management Act. So please understand this architecture. You can expect a mains question here as well. UPSC might ask you to explain the three-tiered disaster management architecture in India, which has been established by the Disaster Management Act. So you have to bring out all these institutions, name them, explain their composition, role, and functions briefly, and maybe draw an organization chart, draw a flow chart or a pyramid-like structure to explain the hierarchy, to depict where these institutions are located in the hierarchy and what roles do they perform. Is that clear? So I'll show you an infographic for that. We'll come to that a little later. If you go a few slides ahead, I've added a couple of charts right, which depicts the organizational structure from national to state to district level. All right, we'll take a look at that a little later. We'll come to that. But first, let's finish NDRF, National Disaster Response Force. It's a very, very important topic. NDRF is very important because NDRF is constantly in the news. Every year, there are multiple disasters in the country, right? There are cyclones, floods, landslides, earthquakes. There are industrial accidents, forest fires. You also have big summits and events in India like G20, the SEO summit, right? Whenever India organizes these big events and summits, even then NDRF is deployed. They're put on standby to deal with any possible disasters, to protect the foreign dignitaries, right? So every year, almost every month, NDRF is in news, right? Every month you look at the newspapers, NDRF will be mentioned. So you can expect a lot of prelims questions. Even a mains question can be asked on the NDRF. So let's understand, how is the NDRF structured, right? What is its role? What responsibilities have been assigned to it? And where are the forces deployed, right? These are some basics that we have to cover about NDRF. So as I told you, NDRF is a specialist force. It's a specialist force that specializes in providing effective response. During a disaster. That is, when a disaster is about to happen, if a disaster is expected to happen, or if a disaster has already happened, right? Or we are in the middle of the disaster, which is ongoing. That is when these specialist response forces are deployed to provide for emergency relief. When I say emergency relief, I'm referring to search and rescue operations, to search for people who are trapped in a disaster, right? There could be a cyclone or a flood where people are trapped in waters. There could be an earthquake where buildings have collapsed and people are trapped under the debris. There could be an industrial disaster where workers are trapped inside a hazardous factory. So to search for those people, to search for the survivors, right, to look out for the dead bodies and to extract them, to rescue, to pull them out, specialist operations have to be conducted. That is the primary role of NDRF. Is that clear? Search and rescue operations. Then, since they are the first responders, they have to provide first aid, basic medical treatment. People will have injuries, right? People might have lost consciousness. They might have burn injuries. They might have fractures, right? They may be in a critical condition. So providing emergency medical aid, first aid, becomes the role of NDRF. Then establishing shelters, providing food, clothing, any other assistance you can think of, like providing water, re-establishing communication where communication has been destroyed because of a disaster. All these are the tasks of NDRF. Is that clear? It's a specialist force. It's not a regular security force as such. It's not like a police organization or a military organization, right? It's different. It's a disaster force. So we have established the NDRF by drawing personnel from our CAPFs. Have you heard of CAPFs? Central Armed Police Forces under the Home Ministry. Just like state governments have state police, similarly, central government also has central police, central armed police. They come under Home Ministry, as Home Ministry deals with internal security, right? The MHA has few central armed police forces. You would have heard about ITBP, BSF, SSB, Assam Rifles. All these are CAPFs, Central Armed Police Forces. From these different Central Armed Police Forces, few battalions have been drawn to raise a specialist force called NDRF. Is that clear? Because initially, if India had freshly recruited personnel into NDRF, their training would have taken a lot of time, right? Recruitment itself would have taken a lot of time. Starting from the scratch would have led to time delay. So what India did was, our CAPFs, they already had some disaster management training. Now, just like Indian Army, Navy, and Air Force also have some disaster management training and help in disasters. Similarly, BSF, CRPF, ITBP, SSB, they all had some expertise in disaster management where they were helping the civilian administration during disasters. So these personnel who already had the basic level of training, they were recruited, they were deputed from CAPFs into this new force called NDRF. And after deputing them, they were given further training. They were given highly specialized training, right? They were sent to other countries as well to learn from foreign countries. They were given special resources, special equipment. And today, NDRF has become one of the leading specialist disaster response forces in the world. It operates under the command of NDMA. It's placed under the superintendence and direction and command of NDMA. So it was raised in the year 2006, immediately after the law was enacted, immediately after the DM Act, without wasting any time. That's why the government didn't have time to raise the force from scratch. That would have taken many, many years. If fresh young recruits were brought in, then if they had to be trained, it would have taken many years to establish NDRF. So the pre-existing forces in CAPFs, some of those battalions which had disaster management training and experience, they were deputed, they were drawn and recruited into NDRF and further trained. So today, NDRF is a well-functioning force, and today it has its own recruitment going on as well. It no longer relies on CAPFs. It was only initially that CAPFs were drawn into it. But now that it has been firmly established, it has been functioning for many years. Today, NDRF is an independent force on its own, functioning under the NDMA. So it was raised in 2006 with 8 battalions drawn from CAPFs. And today, the strength has increased to 12 battalions. The plan is to have at least 20 battalions in the future. The government has planned to further increase this to around 18 to 20 battalions. As of now, we have 12 battalions and a total strength of around anywhere between 13 to 15,000 personnel. So this makes NDRF one of the largest and most formidable disaster response forces in the world. They are trained effectively. They are raised as a proactive force. They are drawn from BSF, CRPF, CISF, ITBP, SSB, and other Central Armed Police forces. Is that clear? They operate as self-contained units. It's like a special force. They don't rely on outside support, right? If they want doctors, they'll have medics in their own team. If they want plumbers, if they want specialists in cutting through equipment by using welding equipment, gas cutters and laser cutters, right? Those specialized workers will be there as part of the team, right? They will have specialist divers and specialist swimmers who can swim and dive to rescue people who are caught in floods. They will have specialists who can paradrop from helicopters. They can be dropped down from helicopters to reach difficult locations. So these are self-contained specialist units that specialize in search and rescue operations. They will even have a dog squad, a canine squad. Dogs are very, very effective in searching for survivors, right? Under debris, when people are trapped, when they are not visible or when they are not audible to us, dogs can play a critical role in picking up the scent of people who are alive and even in tracking dead bodies which are trapped, right? Because people who are dead, they deserve a graceful ceremony, right? The body has to be retrieved, handed over to the families to pay their last respects. So in search and rescue operations, NDRF forces rely on their canine squads. They also use drones and robots to access difficult locations, to scan the debris in order to search for survivors. They have access to special equipment like thermal scanners. They have access to satellite images. They will have satellite phones for uninterrupted communication. Because please remember, communication is critical in any emergency operation. To coordinate with central and state authorities and with other forces, communication is critical. But unfortunately, disaster will wipe out all communication, right? Floods or earthquakes or tsunamis or cyclones, they will first destroy power lines. They will destroy mobile internet connectivity. Mobile towers will be damaged. So your regular communication networks may not work, right? Your internet, broadband, mobile phones, even fixed line telephones, they may not work because that infrastructure might have been completely destroyed. So these specialist teams will carry their own satellite phones. They will have GPS kits for navigation. All right. They will have access to satellite imagery if required to plan their operations, to understand the extent of damage. They have been given specialist technical resources like drones, small autonomous robots, and even thermal scanners through which they can search for survivors. And if they find survivors trapped under debris, right, they can use drones and robots to deliver food and medicine to them so that they can survive until the debris is removed. Because see, please imagine, let's say there is an earthquake, multiple buildings have collapsed, hundreds of people are trapped. So it's not clear where the people are located, right? People will have injuries, they might have lost consciousness. So to figure out who's alive, you need technologies like thermal scanners. You need drones and robots which can sneak into those locations under the debris where humans can't enter, right? They can look out for anyone who's alive and even reach out to them and deliver basic medicines and food and liquids to help them survive till the debris is removed. They will also have large earth moving equipment and cutting equipment. This is also critical. They will need cranes, JCBs. Such heavy vehicles will be needed to lift the debris, to clear all the debris, right? They will need cutting equipment, right? Electric cutters, gas cutters, etc., to cut through steel, iron, and concrete. If buildings have collapsed, obviously there will be a lot of concrete, iron, and steel which has to be cut through in order to reach the victims. So cutting equipment, specialized cutting equipment is needed. They will also have their own boats, life jackets, and all the diving equipment, including oxygen supply, right? Diving equipment will be necessary. Boats, life jackets, motorized boats are needed. These are inflatable boats which can be easily carried and the motor can be attached to it. So such special equipment is given to these units. That is what makes them a truly special force. Is that clear? They get the best training possible. They are very well equipped. They are well trained. They specialize in different disasters, by the way. Some battalions specialize in flood-related management, cyclones and tsunamis. Some battalions will specialize in landslides and earthquakes. Many battalions specialize in CBRN hazard as well. They have special equipment and training to deal with chemical incidents, biological incidents, and even nuclear and radiological incidents. They have gas masks, PPE kits, right? They will have sensors to track radiation level. So all such tools are provided to them to make sure the NDRF is effective even in a CBRN environment. Let's say terrorists have exploded a chemical bomb. Let's say in a war, a bioagent has been released or a nuclear device has been used, right? So specialist response would be needed in such a CBRN environment where the area is contaminated. right? It is contaminated with a hazardous substance, a toxic chemical or a dangerous biohazard or radioactive material. So to reach that place, to operate there safely, the forces will need special training and special gear. They will need protective clothing, protective gear, right? They'll need scanners and tools through which they can measure the contamination level. So they should know how to save people and quarantine them to contain the damage to others. So all such measures are taught to them. So many of the NDRF battalions, they specialize in CBRN hazards as well. Is that clear? So this is what makes the NDRF a specialist force of India, and they are pre-positioned at strategic locations. You can't have this force as a central force stationed only in Delhi, right? Tomorrow, what if there is a mega earthquake in Delhi and NDRF itself is wiped out? Correct? Also, the response time has to be kept in mind. One is the response time. Let's say floods are happening in Kerala. You can't bring NDRF from Delhi to Kerala. You'll not have enough time, right? The NDRF team should be somewhere close by. They should be distributed around the country, and you should ensure their safety in the first place. Since they are first responders, you have to keep them safe from the disaster. Now imagine you deploy NDRF in Himalayan mountains itself. If there is a landslide or earthquake, the forces might be hit. Then who will come to rescue, right? So to ensure their safety, you have to plan their deployment strategically. They should be close enough, but not in the line of risk. So according to this plan, the 12 battalions are strategically deployed across the country, depending on their specialized skills, right? Some specialize in cyclone management. So those teams that specialize in cyclone management, why would you deploy them in North India? North India is not affected by cyclones. Northeast India is not affected by cyclones. So they have to be deployed somewhere along the coast, along the east and west coast of India, and some in the southern parts of India, so they can reach the coastline quickly. So they're not directly in the line of fire, and the response time is very less. Within few hours, they can reach the site. Similarly, forces specializing in earthquakes and landslides, they should be closer to the Himalayan belt, closer to Northeast India, closer to Western Ghats. That is how they have been strategically deployed. So 12 battalions are distributed across the country through a strategic deployment to ensure that they are pre-positioned. That is, even before a disaster can happen, right? To cut down the response time while ensuring the safety of the forces, they are strategically pre-positioned across the country. Now, you don't have to remember the places where they are based out of. That is not needed. It's very factual. UPSC will never ask this. It will never ask that NDRF battalion is in Guwahati, there's one in Pune, Vadodara. Those facts are not needed. Don't mug up this list here. I've just added this for your reference. Just understand this point. Why should they be strategically deployed? Why should they be pre-positioned in different parts of the country? Right? So if you understand that logic, that is more than enough. So the 12 battalions and their teams, their units are distributed across the country strategically, right? So that the response time is less. The response time is less while ensuring their safety first. Both the factors have been taken into account while pre-positioning the NDRF forces. Is that clear? Even their specialist skill is taken into account. In what disaster management do they specialize? Right? Depending on these factors, they have been pre-positioned around the country strategically. All right. Now coming to the last institution, the NIDM, National Institute of Disaster Management. As I told you earlier, it is a research institution focused on capacity development, training, research and development, maintaining database, creating documentation, focusing on understanding the hazard, understanding disaster management response measures. That is the primary role of NIDM. It's essentially a research cum training institution. In simple words, it's a research cum training institution. It has been given the status of a university as a center of excellence. It has been recognized as one of the COEs. It's been recognized as a center of excellence in the field of disaster management. So it conducts extensive studies and research in the field of disasters. It will focus on understanding different disasters, understanding the geographical aspects, the weather-based phenomena, right? Understanding the geological phenomena and bringing out all the research material, documenting past disasters, all right? Creating the required databases, creating training modules based on which NDRF, SDRF, armed forces, police forces, government officials, and even foreign officials can be trained. So based on this understanding, it creates these training courses and training modules, right? For government officials, armed forces, the response forces, and even foreign governments have been taking India's help. They are sending their disaster management teams and officials to NIDM to get them trained in the field of disaster management. So it is playing a key role in enhancing the capacity of our institutions in disaster management. So this institution functions under NDMA, directly under NDMA. So essentially, it's a knowledge-based institution. It's like an academic institution which is organizing the training courses as well. It provides certificate courses, right? It's creating a set of professionals in the country in the field of disaster management. So now, based on this, let's take one final look at the disaster management architecture. Now that you know about all the institutions at the national, state, and district level, let me show you a couple of charts, right, which depicts the organization structure of disaster management institutions in India. It's like a flow chart that gives you a overview or overflow of how decision making happens. We have the Home Ministry here at the top as the nodal ministry, as I explained earlier. Then you have NDMA at the top as well as the nodal authority. Next, you have your Cabinet Committee on Security and the National Crisis Management Committee as well, whenever required. These are two important committees. The Cabinet Committee on Security is the highest decision-making body in the country in the matters of national security. You would have studied this in polity, right? I hope you have gone through Indian polity. So there you would have come across this Cabinet Committee on Security. It comprises the top cabinet ministers headed by the PM. It focuses on national security matters like the defense of India, India's security strategy, defense procurement, intelligence gathering, right? Such critical national security issues are dealt with by the Cabinet Committee on Security. So it is headed by the Prime Minister. It's one of the most powerful cabinet committees, headed by the PM, including the top 4 cabinet ministers: the Defense Minister, Home Minister, Finance Minister, and External Affairs Minister. So these five government representatives, right? They are part of Cabinet Committee on Security. Sometimes disasters can involve a national security aspect, especially CBRN hazards. Correct? So in such cases, the CCS plays a role in decision making. when national security element is involved, right, especially with regard to CBR and hazards, CCS plays a role in guiding NDMA and Home Ministry and other bodies in the field of disaster management. So it's headed by the PM along with the top 4 cabinet ministers. Next, we have National Crisis Management Committee. It's an executive committee headed by the Cabinet Secretary of India as the chairperson. Whenever there is a crisis in the country, it could be a pandemic, it could be a hijacking of a plane, it could be a hostage situation or a major terror attack or a massive disaster or an upcoming cyclone or an earthquake which has already happened. In any such crisis, national crisis, the Crisis Management Committee plays a critical role. It's headed by the Cabinet Secretary. I hope you know who's the Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary heads the Cabinet Secretariat, guides the Union Cabinet, and he or she is the highest ranking civil servant in the country. Just like Chief Secretary is the highest ranking bureaucrat at the state level, similarly, the Cabinet Secretary is the highest ranking civil servant in the whole country, right? Always, it's an IAS officer. A senior IAS officer becomes the Cabinet Secretary of the country. So under their leadership, all secretaries of other ministries and departments come together to achieve coordination in dealing with a crisis. It could be any crisis. It could be a disaster, it could be war or a terror attack. In any such national crisis, the Crisis Management Committee plays a role where the Cabinet Secretary and the top secretaries of all government ministries are together to decide the further action and what policies, what decisions have to be made. They coordinate with other ministries, with state authorities and district level authorities. So these are the other 2 institutions which might get involved in disaster management. Depending on the situation, right? Apart from MHA and NDMA, the other top level decision making bodies are CCS and National Crisis Management Committee. So these are your highest decision making bodies with regard to disaster management. Then you have the National Executive Committee that will implement all the decisions of these top decision making bodies. Is that clear? The decisions of NDMA, Cabinet Committee on Security, Home Ministry, they're all implemented finally through the National Executive Committee. So NDMA has control over NIDM and NDRF. NIDM and NDRF are under the direct control of NDMA. If required, armed forces and CAPFs are also brought into action by coordination from Home Ministry and Defense Ministry. If required, along with NDRF, Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard can also be deployed. Even they have the required assets and training, and even they have some specialization in disaster management, in search and rescue operations. Also in dealing with CBR and hazards. So in such cases, the Army, Navy, or Air Force or Coast Guard might be called in, where Defense Ministry and Home Ministry will coordinate the deployment. So these are your central institutions that will coordinate with the state level authorities. This is how the architecture looks at the national level. Then coming to your state level, you have the NDMA guiding the states from the center. You have various central ministries along with National Executive Committee and Crisis Management Committee, which will also be guiding the state government. Right? That is from the center to state. That's how center-state relations work. Then you have SDMA, the top policy-making body at the state level headed by the CM. And you have the State Executive Committee implementing all these decisions, which is headed by the Chief Secretary of the state. Then there is a SDRF under the SDMA, which is part of the state government. Right? States will have their own disaster response force. And finally, you will have the line agencies, the grassroots institutions who implement the disaster management measures. At the district level, you will have your DDMA, the district level authority, along with various state government agencies and departments, the line agencies and departments, which are at the ground level, that will implement the policies and decisions at the grassroots. So this is the architecture at the state and district level. All right. This represents the broad overflow of decisions, and it helps you understand the hierarchy, the organizational structure with regard to disaster management. Next, another important point is with regard to early warning. This we have discussed in the previous classes, but I'm just adding the table here for your reference. The table is giving you the names of all the important nodal agencies for various disasters with regard to early warning and forecasting. These are the government agencies that provide alerts, early warning alerts in real time to carry out evacuation of people before the disaster happens. So for avalanches, it is the Snow and Avalanche Study Establishment. Kindly remember this, very important for your prelims. For cyclones, as we have studied, it is IMD, India Meteorological Department, under the Ministry of Earth Sciences. For drought, it is the Ministry of Agriculture. Earthquakes, it is IMD again, which measures the earthquakes and studies earthquakes as well. For epidemics and pandemics, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. We saw how the Health Ministry took the lead during COVID-19 pandemic, right? We discussed this as well under epidemics and pandemics. For floods, for monitoring water levels in dams and rivers and issuing flood alerts, it is Central Water Commission. For landslides, it's the Geological Survey of India. And for tsunamis, it is the INCOIS, Indian National Center for Oceanic Information Services. So kindly remember these nodal agencies for various disasters which provide early warning and forecasting. Is that clear? You can also add rain temperature, that is related to heat wave and cold wave, and cloud burst. For all these weather related disasters, it's again IMD, which is the nodal agency. Clear? So this completes my discussion on all the major institutions created through the Disaster Management Act. Now we have come to the last part where we talk about the financing. We'll discuss the funds for disaster management. We'll discuss what is the responsibility of central government and state government when it comes to funds for disaster management. And finally, we'll also talk about India's international efforts. What efforts are we making through our foreign policy, through global institutions to promote disaster management? And that will complete our discussion. So another 10-15 minutes, we should be done with the subject. And we can also look at some questions, some previous questions and your doubts, and then we can close for the day. So let's talk about the National Disaster Response Fund and the National Disaster Mitigation Fund. First, let's focus on the Mitigation Fund. The law provided for establishment of two funds, the Response Fund and Mitigation Fund. Correct? Under DM Act, two funds were supposed to be set up. A National Disaster Response Fund with state disaster response funds, and a National Disaster Mitigation Fund with state disaster mitigation funds. These mitigation funds have not been established. It's not been established primarily due to lack of financial resources. The lack of financial resources at the central level and state level has led the governments to not establish the mitigation fund, which is provided under the law. These funds, if they had been set up, they would help in financing mitigation efforts. See, when do we undertake mitigation efforts? We undertake them in the pre-disaster phase. Correct? By now, I'm sure you know these basics. Mitigation is carried out under pre-disaster phase, where you plan and prepare. Right? If you can't prevent a disaster, you mitigate the impact of a disaster. So you take certain measures, structural measures, policy measures, so that you can cut down the impact of a disaster. So these measures requires dedicated funding, right? That's why a mitigation fund has been provided under the law. But due to lack of financial resources, the mitigation funds have not been established in India. Is that clear? It does not exist as of now. But the response funds have been set up. National Disaster Response Fund with state disaster response funds. This has been established. These funds will provide for emergency response operations. When a disaster has happened, to provide immediate relief, to rehabilitate the people, to give them medical aid, to provide them food and essential supplies, immediate funding will be necessary, right? Immediate funding is needed. Governments can't wait for withdrawing the funds from the consolidated fund. They can't wait for approvals from parliament and state legislature. So for this purpose, for this contingency, a dedicated response fund has been set up. That is your NDRF and SDRF. Some of the previous funds, like National Calamity Contingency Fund, it has been recommended that it should be merged with Response Fund. The Finance Commission has given this recommendation that the Calamity Contingency Fund, which is an older fund that exists, should be merged with the Disaster Response Fund. So today, this has become the primary source of funding for disaster operations in India. All right? The mitigation fund was never set up. The mitigation fund for mitigation measures has never been set up. But calamity contingency fund has been brought together with response fund, and you have a dedicated fund for financing the response operations. So let me tell you how this arrangement works. This is where you understand the center-state relations, the financial aspect of it. See, every state has set up a SDRF and center has set up a NDRF. Now, imagine there is a disaster which has happened. Imagine a disaster has occurred in a particular state. Now, the primary responsibility of providing response, the primary responsibility to conduct relief operations lies with your state government. And the funding will come from SDRF. Is that clear? Now let's say recently there were floods and landslides in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. So in case of these disasters, the primary responsibility to conduct response operations, to provide relief, lies with state government, not the central government. Through the district authorities, it's a state government which will lead the efforts. And the funding also has to come from the state. Is that clear? But the state fund is largely financed by the NDRF. So basically, in the union budget, a dedicated allocation is made into NDRF. All right, a certain sum of money is set aside for NDRF. From this fund, the money is distributed to various states based on their disaster risk. See, all states cannot be given the same amount because some are large states, some are very small states. Some states face a very big risk of disasters. Some have no risk of disaster or low risk, a very zero or minimal risk of disasters, right? So depending on various factors, each state is provided a different allocation. Is that clear? Like Uttarakhand, Kerala, northeastern states, border states, they are more vulnerable, right? Odisha, they face a bigger risk. So such states are given more funding compared to the safer states, the relatively safer states. So from NDRF, there is a allocation, a pre-allocation which is made into SDRF. It's a budgetary allocation through the union budget itself. Funds are devolved into it and provided to the concerned states. So from this fund, states have to spend for their response and relief operations. States can also levy taxes and they can make their own budgetary allocation as well, additionally, into the SDRF. In fact, there is a ratio for this. For SDRF funding, there is a ratio. 75% of the funds will come from the central government. 25% will be raised by the states in case of general category states. For special category states, it is 90:10, where center provides 90% funding. 10% has to be arranged by the special category states. That is primarily your border states and hilly states, which are remote, which face a higher risk. All right, northeastern states, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, Jammu and Kashmir, etc. So SDRF is the primary fund. There is a pre-allocation made. NDRF, through NDRF, adequate funds are already made available. All right. This is the arrangement that exists. So center would have already made an allocation to different states depending on their disaster risk. Funding ratio is 75:25 or 90:10, depending on which state it is. So remaining part of it is raised by the states through their own budget, through their own taxes. Now, the question is, what will happen if the funds are exhausted? Let's say Kerala has been given 700 crore rupees and Kerala has raised another 25% on its own. Let's say close to 1,000 crore rupees is available with Kerala government. But Kerala faces so many disasters. Let's say in a given year, it's been hit by multiple floods, landslides, cyclones. So the Kerala government has spent all the funds. It has run out of money from SDRF. Now what will Kerala government do? That is when states can request. They can request additional central assistance. Additional allocation from NDRF can be made if states make a request. But this can be done only when SDRF funds are exhausted. When funds are still available in SDRF, the request cannot be raised. Only when states' funds are overwhelmed, only when state is not left with any more funds, right? And if multiple disasters are overwhelming the capacity of the state, that is when it can make a special request for the central government to release more funds to provide additional central assistance into the SDRF. So to do this, there is a condition and there is a process. The states will submit a request. Based on the request, the center will appoint. It will appoint an inter-ministerial team. It will constitute an inter-ministerial team of officials who will visit the state and they will conduct a review. They will look at the impact of the disasters. They will look at the funds available, the funds which have already been spent, right? Based on this, the review team will submit a report and then center can accept or reject the request for additional funding. So additional funding is not guaranteed. Is that clear? The provision is there under the law. The DM Act provides for that. Is that clear? See, first of all, SDRF is the primary fund for using in response and relief operations. Center has already provided allocation to all the states through NDRF. Correct? 75% for regular states, general category states, 90% for special category states. States raise their own funds to fill the gap, 25% and 10%, through their own budget and taxes. Now, if the SDRF funds are not enough, if a state is affected by multiple disasters and the funds are exhausted, then states have the option to raise a request for additional central assistance from the NDRF. Another allocation can be made. But the condition is that states can only submit a request. It's not mandatory for the center to accept this. So center will constitute a review team, an interministerial review team of officials from NDMA, from various important ministries and scientific institutions are brought. And this team is sent to the state to conduct a review. So based on their review report, based on the damage caused, the funds which have been spent, funds which are available, based on this, a final report is submitted by the team to the central government. Finally, it is left to the center whether to accept or reject. It can give more funds or it can deny it as well. Is that clear? Now, I'm stressing on this point again and again because it's a very, very important topic. Every time there is a controversy in India between central government and states that are especially ruled by opposition parties, there is an allegation that the ruling party at the center discriminates against states which are ruled by opposition parties. It is alleged that, right, not just now, even previously as well, it's alleged that the ruling party at the center, whether it's Congress or BJP, they have discriminated against states that are ruled by the opposition. All right? They have given funds, additional funds, to states ruled by their own party, whereas they have denied funds in genuine cases as well, apparently, for states ruled by the opposition. This is the controversy. This is the allegation which is made by certain states. Like recently, for example, Kerala and West Bengal, which are ruled by the opposition, they alleged that the ruling BJP has discriminated against them and denied additional funds to them, even though the states have been hit by multiple disasters. Whereas center has given additional funding to other states ruled by the BJP itself. So we are not judging this politically. Let's not get into the political aspect. That is not relevant for our exam. But please understand that there exists a controversy here, a political controversy. Since central government has the discretion to either provide or deny additional funding, there is a possibility of such misuse happening on political grounds. Is that clear? So please understand, states can request additional funding, but center has a discretion. It will set up a review team. Based on the report of the review team, center can either provide more funds or reject the request. That is the key point you take away from this discussion. So central government is essentially supplementing the efforts and resources of the state government. Is that clear? When a disaster happens, NDMA and Home Ministry, they will provide response forces. They will provide the required response forces. Even Defense Ministry will get involved. They will provide the required response forces to the state and district authorities. Now it is left to them as to how they will utilize them. At the district level, the DC has a critical role. The DC has powers to call the armed forces if required when civilian administration is overwhelmed. If capacity of civilian administration is overwhelmed, the DC need not wait for any permission or approval. That is why this role is a very powerful role. without consulting the state government or his superiors or the chief minister or the central government. The DC can reach out to the local command headquarters of the security forces and directly call in their assistance when civilian administration's capacity is breached during a crisis. Is that clear? So center is supplementing the state. It is giving the required forces, required funds. Finally, the responsibility lies with the state. Execution will happen at the district level through the district authorities. So this is the structure that exists. This is how the center-state relations work in case of disaster management. All right? Center will make the broad policy. It will incorporate international principles. It will bring the required funds. It will raise special forces and give those forces as well to the states and districts. Finally, how they will be used on the ground is up to the state government and the district authorities. Of course, they will receive directions and guidance from the center. Center can always give those orders, but the actual execution happens through the state government and the district authorities. Is that clear? So please understand this and make a note. Make a note when states can ask additional assistance. I've listed the points here. I've given the process as well, explained those points, and I've written them down as well. So this completes our understanding of funding with regard to disaster response and whether states have the option to ask for more funding. All right. Next, a related point. What about foreign assistance? Can states accept foreign assistance? Let's say a friendly foreign government has announced a financial aid. Maybe it has announced it directly to Government of India or maybe to a state government. Or let's say a global organization like United Nations, for example. Or let's say a global NGO. What if they announce funds to India? What will happen? What does the law say and what is the practice that we have in place? That is something we should understand. Because this comes up every now and then. For example, during recent Kerala floods, UAE reportedly announced a $300 million assistance to the government of Kerala. All right. There was a rumor. It was reported that UAE is looking to give this assistance directly to Kerala government. But Kerala raised a complaint. It raised a controversy saying that the ruling central government, the ruling BJP, is not allowing us to accept foreign funds. So again, it became a political controversy. So let's understand what can governments do when foreign entities announce support for India. See, they will do this out of sympathy, right? They empathize with India when there is a disaster, when there is large-scale suffering. They will announce some assistance and support to us. But do we accept that or not? That is the question. What does the law say? The Disaster Management Act leaves the decision correctly to the government of India because this is a foreign policy matter. It's a foreign policy issue. Accepting or denying assistance from foreign entities will have consequences for Indian foreign policy. And foreign policy is a union subject. So the DM Act has left the decision to the Indian government. States can't decide. States can't request their own funding. They can't ask foreign donors for assistance. All right. The matter is left to the government of India. It may allow foreign assistance. That is what the law says. The DM Act says that if a foreign government or a foreign organization or an NGO, if they announce financial assistance for India, the government of India will decide and it may allow. It does not prohibit. The law is not prohibiting. There is no prohibition on accepting foreign donation. Foreign donation can be accepted, but the decision is left to Government of India. Is that clear? So it may allow the foreign donation to be accepted, But the decision lies with the government of India, primarily with Ministry of External Affairs, which is responsible for the foreign policy of the country. Now, please understand, accepting foreign donation can bring its own obligation. See, some countries might genuinely announce a foreign donation, right? During a major crisis, they might empathize with India, right? And they might announce donations to India. Now, if India accepts such donations directly through the government itself, then in a way it creates a dependency. Because foreign policy is always about a reciprocal relationship. You give something and you take something. So today, if they're contributing something, tomorrow they'll expect something else from us. So we don't want any such unnecessary obligation which could affect our foreign policy and national interests. So that is why there is a convention in place. As a matter of convention, then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh laid out a principle that India will not accept foreign assistance. Since the law has left the decision to the government of India, the then government of India, headed by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, decided that we will not accept foreign assistance because we don't need any obligations. No obligations should be there on our foreign policy. Tomorrow, the country which has given funds should not expect favors from India. Others should not expect similar donations from India. That should not become an obligation, right? So that is why the government has decided that we will not accept the foreign assistance. So if a country announces such support, if let's say UAE or US or Australia, right, or even China, any country, if they announce such financial aid, the stand of MEA is that we will politely decline the offer by thanking the country. The MEA and the country's ambassador, they will reach out to the government, right? The Prime Minister will also reach out. Personally, we'll thank them. We'll say thank you for your kindness. Thanks for reaching out. But we don't need this assistance as of now. Politely, India will decline the offer, right? We shouldn't hurt their feelings because when they're genuinely providing aid and assistance, right? You can't be rude. You have to follow the diplomatic protocols. So India will thank those countries, express gratitude to them, and politely we will decline the offer. This is the stand of the Indian government. It's a more of a convention that has been followed. But in the future, there is no prohibition. Tomorrow, let's say there is a mega disaster in India where our capabilities are overwhelmed, where Indian government, state governments are not able to deal with it. Then tomorrow we still have an option to ask for foreign assistance. If someone else announces it, we can take that assistance if required. Right now, we are not taking it. In the last 18 years, we are not taking it because India is self-sufficient. This was the logic of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh when he laid a condition that will not accept foreign assistance. That India, as an emerging economy, has become self-sufficient today. We have enough financial resources, enough technical resources on our own to manage our own disasters. We don't need outside help as of now. If required, we'll ask for that. If required, we'll take that help. So the current practice is that we don't accept foreign assistance. We'll thank them and we'll politely decline the offer. Is that clear? But however, if global organizations and NGOs announce it, then India will ask them to channel the funds through local NGOs. Government will not take it again. Government of India and state governments cannot take assistance directly from UN or any other body or even from global NGOs. All right? If they are announcing any donation, we will accept it, but they should channel this through local NGOs and help the victims, help the survivors. Government will not accept those funds directly. It will allow global NGOs and international organizations to work with local partners, with social service organizations, NGOs, and state governments in implementing the relief measures. But Government of India will not accept any foreign assistance. That is the established norm. The law is not prohibiting it. The option is always there. But current policy is that we will not accept because we are self-sufficient. It's about India's image as well. We are no longer an extremely poor country, right? We are a vibrant developing economy with our own resources, capable of dealing with our own disasters. Plus, we don't want any foreign obligations, right? Tomorrow, we don't want countries expecting things from India. So the current policy is that we don't accept, we politely deny and thank them, but we allow international organizations and NGOs to channel the funds into local partners. Again, government will not take it. They will allow them to implement relief measures through other local NGOs. So this is India's stand regarding foreign assistance. Is that clear? Please understand these points. It's very, very important. I'm presenting all the nuances here. So state governments and NGOs may be allowed to take funds from UN and international NGOs. All right? State governments or local NGOs in India, domestic NGOs, they might be allowed to take in the help from UN and international organizations if required. Now, coming to the last point here, what about our international efforts? What are we doing through our foreign policy to promote disaster management? There are some important points you have to note down. Today, India has become a global leader in the field of disaster management. We are one of the leading powers, right? We discussed, we are providing cyclone alerts through IMD, through the regional center in India, to several countries in Northern Indian Ocean. We are giving tsunami alerts to 28 countries across Indian Ocean. And we are providing HADR assistance. We are providing HADR assistance to friendly countries. There are many examples where India has provided humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. For example, in 2015, Nepal was hit by a massive earthquake and India conducted Operation Maitri, where NDRF and Indian Army and Indian Air Force were deployed to rescue people in Nepal. Is that clear? When Nepal was hit by this devastating earthquake, Operation Maitri was conducted by Indian forces, including NDRF and Indian Army, to provide HADR support, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief support. Recently, when Turkey and Syria were hit by a massive earthquake, we conducted Operation Dost. Right? We sent NDRF teams and medics from Indian Army to give basic assistance and carry out search and rescue operations in Turkey and Syria. We have done this across the Indian Ocean. We have helped Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka during cyclones and tsunamis. We have helped East Africa, like countries like Mozambique. East African country of Mozambique is hit by cyclones. Right? Indian Navy has recently sent assistance in the last 1 year itself to help Mozambique. We have helped Maldives. We have helped Indonesia, Thailand. We have helped Mauritius. So all these Indian Ocean countries are assisted by India through HADR operations. Is that clear? Please remember this point. It's very, very important. We have incorporated the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Right? We are signatory to all the UN frameworks. We have incorporated the priorities and targets of Sendai framework into our national policy and plan. We are sharing our expertise through regional and global cooperation. We are sharing early warning alerts for cyclones, for tsunamis, and other such disasters. We are also helping other countries in training their disaster management forces at NIDM and also through NDRF and through Indian Armed Forces. For example, if you look at any military exercise, in which India participates, HADR operations are integral to the military exercises. Like recently, we had Malabar exercise with Japan, US, and Australia. Right? We have had military exercises with Singapore, with UAE, and with many other countries. Right? In almost every military exercise, there is a HADR component. Focusing on disaster management is part of it. There are many regional groupings like BIMSTEC, SARC, IORA. At all these platforms, we have promoted disaster management, and we have even held disaster management exercises or HADR operations with these groupings. Right? BIMSTEC brings all Bay of Bengal countries together with Myanmar, Bangladesh, then Sri Lanka, Thailand, Nepal, and Bhutan. Through BIMSTEC, we have organized disaster management exercises, and there is a coordination center. In fact, India is responsible through BIMSTEC to assist all the BIMSTEC countries in disaster management. A dedicated disaster management exercise has been held. Under SARC, you have a SARC disaster management center where South Asian countries are cooperating. Under Indian Ocean Rim Association, disaster management is a priority. Even under the Quadrilateral, under East Asia Summit, and even in our relations with ASEAN and various important groups, disaster management and HADR operations are a priority. Is that clear? So this is just an example to show how India is making or taking international efforts as well in the field of disaster management. We are working closely with UN to achieve sustainable development goals. Even sustainable development goals include a target on disaster management. Then COVID-19 was a classic example. During the pandemic, India did a phenomenal job at helping other countries. I don't know if you remember, we carried out Mission Sagar through the Indian Navy as soon as the pandemic broke out. Under Mission Sagar, Indian Navy carried essential supplies, basic oxygen supplies, PPE kits, sanitizers, then all other essential medicines and drugs needed to fight the pandemic. We provided these supplies to all our neighboring countries and across Indian Ocean. We supplied to Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, all East African countries like Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, even Vietnam, Afghanistan, then Bhutan and Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar. They all got free supplies from India under Mission Sagar during COVID-19. Even through SARC, India announced an initiative to help the SARC countries combat COVID-19. We gave free supplies to all our neighbors through the SARC organization. We conducted vaccine diplomacy under Vaccine Maitri. India supplied free vaccine, the domestically produced vaccine was freely supplied by India to several friendly countries all across the region. So Bhutan, Afghanistan, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Maldives, they all received free vaccine supplies from India to combat the pandemic. This is a recent example, right? It clearly shows what efforts India has made in the field of disaster management. We have not only transformed disaster management inside our country, but we are helping other countries as well by giving early warning, by sharing our expertise, by helping them in training, and by also conducting HADR operations. Is that clear? So we send medicines, food supplies, our rescue forces are sent to conduct search and rescue operations, and we even announce financial aid, financial support to the affected countries. So on this note, I would like to bring my discussion to an end. We have completed all the important topics in disaster management. This is more than sufficient. Please don't read anything beyond this. We have covered every single topic that is needed. Please take a look at the mains questions, the previous year's questions. It will give you a fair idea as to what kind of questions has UPSC been asking. Now let's look at all your doubts, all your questions. I'll discuss maybe a couple of questions as well. And after that, we can end the session. Is that clear? So please go ahead, ask me any doubt or any question. We can spend few minutes on that. Meanwhile, go through the questions that have come previously. I've added as many questions as possible, right? Till 2021 questions are added here. Please look up the 2022 questions as well. So just look at them. I will pick up 2 or 3 for a discussion, but first we'll look at your doubts. Pratham is asking, does India provide financial aid to any other country? Yes, I just told you, we do provide or announce financial aid to other countries which are affected by disasters. Next, Deepika is asking, can you briefly explain how the threshold of NDRF funds are decided and the frequency of the replenishment? See, the replenishment of the fund happens during every budget. In the annual budget, right? The required allocation is made into all the SDRF funds depending on how much funds have been spent. Some states may not have spent anything. They may not have witnessed any disaster. Those states are not given any fresh allocation. But those states which have spent from their SDRF, right, which have exhausted the funds, their funds will be replenished. It will be done on an annual basis through the annual budget. Manoj is asking, sir, we do not accept funds, but can we accept HADR response from other countries in the form of personnel? Even here, we have not accepted, but we can. See, right now we are self-sufficient, we are capable. So right now the policy is we don't need material support as well. We don't need personnel from other countries or food or medicines from other countries. But if there is a disaster where we are overwhelmed, where we are not able to deal with it, then yes, we always have the option of asking material help from other countries, right? Like asking disaster response forces, food, medicines, shelter, etc. All such equipment can be asked in material instead of asking in cash. So that option is always there. But we don't take that in the last 20 years because we are self-sufficient. Alok is asking, sir, the information and content in PPT is enough if you mention current affairs with it? Yes. The PPT and the notes that we have written, right? The annotations, the class notes you have written, the short notes you have made, and current affairs. That is more than sufficient. Anusha is asking, if center does not provide assistance to states in terms of money, can it help by sending personnel? The center already does that, right? NDRF and armed forces are already sent. Only the additional assistance, additional funds, right, that might be rejected or it may be accepted as well. But personnel support is always given. Logistical support, technical support is always given. Abhijit is asking, please tell about International Nuclear Radiological Event Scale. See, just like you have a scale to measure the impact of different disasters, right? To understand the magnitude of a nuclear incident or a radiological incident, this scale has been developed by International Atomic Energy Agency. Like, for example, to measure earthquakes, we have Richter scale, correct? The magnitude of an earthquake is depicted on a Richter scale. So when we say magnitude 5 earthquake, magnitude 9 earthquake, we understand what is the impact, what is the damage caused. So it helps in spreading the awareness amongst the people and in planning the response for the disaster when you measure the impact of the disaster. Similarly, for nuclear and radiological incidents, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, along with OECD from Europe, they developed INES, the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale. It was developed after the Chernobyl disaster, so that the scale of the crisis, the extent of radioactive leakage, the extent of the disaster and damage can be depicted in terms of its magnitude on this INES scale. Rahul is asking, sir, I want to know how NGOs of India channel to occupied assist any country, NGO, and organization beside. Rahul, your question is not properly framed. It's grammatically not correct. I'm not able to understand what you're asking. Please ensure the sentence is grammatically correct. The question has to make sense. Only then I'll be able to understand what you're asking. Neelkant is asking, when India gives money to another country, it takes it back from that country. No, we are giving aid, we are giving assistance to help the other country. Why will we take it back? We don't take it back. It's a grant, it's like a charity that we are doing. It's sort of goodwill that we are trying to help the other country. So we don't take that back. It's a one-time assistance that we provide. Deepika is asking, sir, even though National Disaster Mitigation Fund is not set up yet, the efforts to mitigate disasters are in place. Yes, you're right. From regularly available funds, mitigation efforts are being financed. We don't have a dedicated fund. All right. The National Disaster Mitigation Fund has not been set up. It means we don't have a dedicated fund for mitigation efforts. But does not mean mitigation efforts are stopped. Mitigation measures will be undertaken with the regular funding that's available through the regular budgetary allocations and through response funds if needed. Mitigation efforts are undertaken. They are taken up by the state governments and central government. But we don't have a dedicated mitigation fund. Anusha is asking, sir, has it ever happened that a state is in dire need of additional assistance from center, but the center has refused? We haven't seen such an incident happening. Center has not completely refused the request. It has reduced the amount. Let's say a state might have asked 500 crores in additional funding. Center will conduct a review. Based on it, it might approve 300 crores. So we haven't seen an instance where it has been entirely rejected, right? So that has not happened, but finally some amount is released to help out the states. Munna is asking, can anyone donate into disaster management response fund? No. Response fund is through budgetary allocation, through government taxes. Private individuals can't donate into it. For that, you have other funds. You have Prime Minister's Relief Fund, Chief Minister's Relief Fund, right? For COVID-19, a separate fund was created under the Prime Minister, right? So into those funds, private individuals, companies, corporates can donate, but not into the response fund. Response fund is a state fund. It's a government fund. Alok is asking, sir, when we provide financial assistance to another country, aren't we placing obligations on them for helping us during times of distress? See, first of all, India does not believe in transactional relationship. If you have understood India's foreign policy, right, you will know the answer to this. We genuinely help other countries without expecting anything in return. That is something India has quite consistently followed. That is how you generate goodwill. That is how you generate soft power, right? That's how you retain and protect your influence in other countries. But also, even if it's putting some obligations, that's good for us. We might get a favor from that country tomorrow, right? So that's not a problem. We don't want obligations on us. We don't mind putting obligations on others if required, because if it pays back someday, right, that's always good for India. Akula is asking, can government issue green bonds to assist victims? India has not explored the bond market or even the stock market for assisting victims. We haven't done that. Right now, social stocks are being encouraged in the share market, right? You would have read that in economics in the union budget, but it is yet to be implemented. Just like you have a stock exchange for private shares, for shares of private companies. Similarly, NGOs and social organizations can also list on a social stock exchange. That's a great proposal made in the budget. It will be implemented soon. But we don't have a dedicated bond market as of now. Government has never raised such form of funding for disasters. Rahul is asking, can NGOs of India take financial assistance from foreign country NGO? Yes, they can, but it has to go through the correct route. We have a law for regulating foreign funding into NGOs. So all those norms have to be met. It has to be approved by the government. Only then Indian NGOs can take funding from foreign entities. All right. So guys, these are the questions. Now let's look at a couple of mains questions from the previous question paper. Let's look at some PYQs. Right? Nothing much to discuss, but I'll just show you the questions and tell you how you can approach answer writing. These are topics which we have already covered in detail. So the moment you look at a mains question, always read the question carefully. Understand what the question is asking. Break down the question into sub questions and ensure that your answer will do justice to all the components, all the sub parts in the question. Now, for example, let's take this first question from 2013. How important are vulnerability and risk assessment for pre-disaster management? As an administrator, what are the key areas that you would focus in disaster management? Very simple, very straightforward. If you understood the concept of vulnerability and risk assessment, you can explain that in the introduction and in the first part of your body. Give the explanation of vulnerability. Take an example. Explain what is disaster risk, how hazard, vulnerability, and exposure create disaster risk, why it is important to assess the disaster risk. Because when you know disaster risk, you can focus on reducing the vulnerability. You can focus on reducing the exposure. So explain this concept, right? And give an example. Take earthquakes or landslides or cyclones hitting the east coast of India. Take some recent disaster which has happened. There explain the concept of vulnerability and risk assessment. So that will substantiate your argument. Then, as an administrator, what areas would you prioritize in disaster management? You basically have to talk about the disaster management cycle. Briefly, in the second part of the body, draw the DM cycle, show the 3 phases of disaster management, and quickly list out briefly which areas are a priority for you. Right? Maybe in pre-disaster, you can prioritize planning. During disaster, effective relief, and post-disaster reconstruction. Point out these priority areas and why, and that completes and concludes your answer. That's why I told you disaster management is an easy subject. Once you understand the concepts, once you're thorough with current affairs, it's very easy to write good answers and score well. Don't neglect the subject. You get 4 questions here. You can score very well in disaster management. Let's look at this question from 2015. Frequency of earthquakes appears to have increased in the Indian subcontinent. However, India's preparedness for mitigating their impact has significant gaps. Discuss. Basically, you have to talk about earthquakes in India. Explain why India is witnessing an increase in earthquakes. Explain why India is vulnerable, how the Indian plate is subsiding, diving under the Eurasian plate, how the entire Himalayan belt, northeast India, right, parts of Gujarat, Andaman Nicobar Islands, how they are vulnerable to earthquakes. Explain the geography behind it. So in the introduction and in the first half of your body, approach this from a geography perspective. Explain India's vulnerability to earthquakes. If required, draw a rough map of India showing the seismic zones, especially zone 5 and zone 4. So once you explain this, talk about the preparedness needed and where we are lacking. I explained this very clearly. We are lacking in enforcing the building codes. Our buildings, our infrastructure, they are not earthquake resistant. They're not earthquake proof. Even in high risk zones like Delhi, across the Himalayan belt, right? We haven't followed the basic norms. Our critical infrastructure is not earthquake proof. Most of the private buildings are not earthquake proof. This is due to lack of enforcement, due to corruption and the poor enforcement of building standards at the ground level, right? This is one major example you can give. Then the lack of zonation, the lack of land use planning, how we have not, planned our cities. We haven't planned our cities and towns to make them naturally disaster resilient. So please mention all these points, and that completes your answer. Next, let's take up a question from here, 2017 question. On December 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami wreaked havoc on 14 countries, including India. Discuss the factors responsible for occurrence of tsunami, its effects on life and economy. In the light of guidelines of 2010, describe the mechanism for preparedness to reduce the risk during such events. There are basically three questions here. First, you have to talk about 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Briefly, in the introduction, explain how this tsunami was generated because of an underwater earthquake near Sumatra in Indonesia. How the tsunami destroyed multiple countries across Indian Ocean, from Thailand to Myanmar to India, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and East Africa. Explain that Andaman Nicobar, Tamil Nadu, and east coast of India took the biggest hit, and more than 1 lakh people were killed, along with severe damage to life and property. So explain the phenomena involved, the factors responsible for causing a tsunami, natural and man-made. Right? We have discussed this in detail. Mention underwater earthquakes, volcanoes, volcanic eruptions, meteor strike, nuclear explosions. Explain all the reasons. Explain the long wavelength phenomena, how the tsunami wave gains height, and how it crashes, causing damage to life and property. How it can threaten critical infrastructure, how it can flood coastal areas and damage the environment. Please bring out this explanation. And finally, talk about the measures to deal with tsunami. We have discussed that. That's nothing but the guidelines of NDMA. What measures can we take? Early warning through inquires. Correct? Alerts, quick dissemination of alerts in coastal areas, installing sirens, sending text messages, warning people to evacuate. You should have created cyclone shelters or tsunami shelters where people can be evacuated. Creating retention walls, protecting natural buffers like wetlands, mangrove forests, right? All these measures can be discussed for finally focusing on reconstruction as well. So this is the approach for your answer writing. We have had questions on Sendai framework and Hyogo framework as well. Very straightforward question. Then questions on basic concepts like vulnerability. In fact, this is like a repeat question. We already had a question on vulnerability. Now there's one more question here in 2019. So sometimes the questions can be so easy, right? So don't worry about this subject. Don't ignore or don't worry. Approach this with the right intention. Cover the syllabus quickly, revise everything, practice all these questions, write answers to all the previous questions. Half your task is done. Is that clear? So I really expect all of you to put in that extra effort, because you might get questions in geography, in environment ecology, in IR, in polity, in economy as well. You might get an essay paper on disasters. So please be prepared. Don't neglect this subject. It's very interesting, and I'm sure you guys have understood most of what we have discussed in class. So do let me know how the classes went. All right, do let me know in the comments. I think a feedback form will also be shared with you. So please let us know so that we can make any improvements if needed. And if you liked it, please let us know that as well. So that is it for now. I hope you guys have understood everything. So I expect you guys to take up all the questions for your answer writing practice. Got it? So that is it from my side. Let's end the session for today. I'll see you hopefully next time, maybe with another subject. Till then, take care, all the best, prepare well, and I'll see you soon.